Hello again. Welcome back. I'm Rob Crisell. If you're here, you must have watched my introduction. If you didn't, better do it right now. This is the second part of the Young Poets Workshop, and we're going to have a good time today. Let's just summarize what we learned in that introductory class in our last session. First, we read and analyzed Robert Burns' Red, Red Rose. Then we discussed what makes a poem and what distinguishes it from other types of writing. Then we talked about the differences between pretty flower poems and iceberg poems. We read and analyzed Tupac Shakur's Rose That Grew from Concrete. We compared poems to juicy oranges. We talked about how important it is to squeeze the juice out of those oranges when we're reading those poems aloud, and how important it is to read poems out loud. We discussed the need to use the same skills in reading a poem as actors use. Understanding, that's most important, but eye contact, focus, posture, voice projection, energy, passion, expression. I introduced some figurative and literary devices that poets use to create their poems, including imagery, metaphor, simile, personification, alliteration, assonance, consonance, repetition, hyperbole, and we're going to talk about those in more detail in other sessions, but at least we introduced them in that introduction. And then we read and analyzed John Keats' poem, This Hand Now Warm and Capable, the one where he's reaching out from the grave. And we talked about the relationship between poets and readers. And finally, I shared the 14 metaphorical definitions of what a poem is, and I discussed two of the ones that meant a lot to me. This course is for everybody. Poetry is not brain surgery. It is fun, accessible, but some poems, as I said, make you sweat a little bit. So, speaking of sweating, at the last part of the last class, I told you I wanted to start by reading a very famous poem called Jabberwocky. It's a very fun poem, and it's written by a man named Lewis Carroll. You've probably heard of Lewis Carroll. He wrote a book that you probably are familiar with. Even if you haven't read it, you might have even seen a movie based on the book, and that book was called Alice in Wonderland, or Through the Looking Glass. And in that book, Lewis Carroll includes a poem called Jabberwocky. Now, a lot of people have said this is the most famous nonsense poem ever written, and it's going to introduce a little concept called onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia. Say it with me right now. Ready? Onomatopoeia. Yeah, it's a fun word to say, impossible to spell. And usually I can't even get it out of my mouth when I'm in front of a class, but I had practice today. Onomatopoeia. Anyway, onomatopoeia is this concept that a word sounds like what it is. So howl, or sizzle, or chop, or crash, those actually sound like what they are. Sizzle sounds like bacon sizzling on or frying in a pan. And so the word sounds like what it is. So Jabberwocky has a bunch of words that Lewis Carroll made up because they sound like what he's describing. Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the Jubjub bird, and shun the frumious Bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the manxome foe he sought. So rested he by the Tumtum tree, and stood a while in thought. And as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock, with eyes of flame, came whiffling through the tulgey wood, and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabjous day, callooh, callay, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe. Look at that first stanza. Remember what stanzas are, right? They're the rooms in your house. Look at that first room in this house that Lewis Carroll built. hardly any of those words are in the English dictionary. Some of those words are so famous in this poem that they became words in the English language. For example, there in the second to last stanza, chortle. Chortle was a word that he made up in this poem back in the 1800s. And it means something like snort and chuckle. And he put them together to make chortle. And chortle is now a word that we use in the English language. Also, galumphing. That's more unusual, but you can look in the dictionary and you'll find galumphing. These words don't mean anything, but they sound kind of like what he hopes you envision in your mind. So even though you don't know many of these words, I bet you can tell me what this poem is about. First of all, what kind of poem is it? Is it a pretty flower poem? Is it an iceberg poem? What do you think? I think it's a pretty flower poem, because what is it about? Let's find the literal meaning of this poem. It's about a kid, a boy probably, because he's identified as a boy later on, who goes out and he looks for and then fights and kills and chops off the head of a Jabberwock or a Jabberwocky. Do you know what a Jabberwocky is? Yeah, neither do I. Nobody does, because he just made it up. But you get this feeling. It flies around. It goes through Tulgey Woods, whatever. And so the boy takes his Vorpal sword. What does that mean? Who knows? Sounds cool, though. Vorpal sword. And he snicker-snack. Isn't that a great onomatopoeic word? Words that he made up. Snicker-snack. That's the sound of the sword chopping off the Jabberwocky's head. And he comes back with the head in his hand, and he's congratulated by the father in the story. That's what it's about. It's a story poem. Lots of poems just tell exciting stories, and Jabberwocky is certainly one of those poems. Now, I've had other students, when I've taught this in class, tell me, no, Mr. Crisell, you're wrong. This poem is an iceberg poem, because it seems to be just about a kid fighting some evil monster, but what it's really about is a child overcoming his or her fears and conquering something and accomplishing something great in the world, even though they had all these fears. So it's about overcoming a difficulty in your life. And I have to tell them, you are probably right. Remember, poems are different for different people, and different people are going to find often different meanings when they read a poem. And so sometimes poems can be pretty flowers, and they can be iceberg poems, and it just depends on how closely you want to read that poem. So anyway, we're done with Jabberwocky. So you now have the basic definition of what a poem is and how poems are created. You have a metaphorical and figurative description of the purpose of poetry. And now we're going to read some poems together for the rest of this particular lesson. Now, I'll be reading the poems. Normally, if I were in a classroom, I would have students read the poems. So I do want you to read each of these poems that I'm going to read. Maybe you could pause this video and read it before me, or read it after me, or whatever. At some point, I want you to read it, and I don't want you to just read it. I want you to try to squeeze the juice out of it. That means you're going to have to read it out loud. So some of these poems are very straightforward and funny. They're just pretty flower poems, but some of these are going to be iceberg poems. I'm not going to analyze them with you here. I just want to present to you the full diversity of poems for maybe the next 15 minutes. All right? Okay, so here's our first one. I think you probably recognize this particular poem. It's a nursery rhyme, and I'll read it. Traditional nursery rhyme by anonymous person, dates to around 18th century England. Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon. The little dog laughed to see such sport, and the dish ran away with the spoon. All right, what does that poem mean? Nothing. It's just a funny little story about a cat and a dog and a cow, various silverware. So it's something you tell to your kids when they go to sleep. It just sounds good. It's an earworm poem. It's fun, pretty flower poem. All right, so that's one thing a poem can do. A poem can be very simple and straightforward and fun, light, silly, easy. So here's another one. Now, this poem looks very simple too. This is Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson is a poet, really one of the most famous poets in American history. She didn't have many of her poems published when she was alive. She was kind of a recluse. That means she liked to keep to herself. She lived in her parents' house until she died, and she was kind of afraid to go outside. But was obviously brilliant and kind of a genius poet. And so I'm going to read this. I'm going to read one verse, the first verse of this poem. Hope is the Thing with Feathers by Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. All right. Pretty cool verse, right? She's using what? What technique is she using? Personification, right? Hope, the abiding sense of hope that you have, that's in your heart, that's in your soul, is a thing with feathers. So now you get this image of a bird. But what does this poem mean? I don't know. I suggest you read the other verses and come up with your own conclusion. Emily Dickinson's poems always look very simple and easy, but they're definitely iceberg poems. You have to do a little work to find out what she means. All right, so poems can also be long, ambiguous, and very, very difficult. And one of the most difficult poems to interpret is this one. And I'm just going to read the first 4 lines of it. It is a poem called The Wasteland, and it's by my favorite poet, I think, in the whole world. His name is T.S. Eliot. And I will just read the first 4 lines. It is the entire poem is 430 lines long, but I'm just going to read the first 4 lines, the first sentence. The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. All right, now, just one sentence, but that poem is hard to unpack. There's meaning in there. I could explain it to you if you gave me half an hour, but I think it has something to do with April. Why is April cruel? That's kind of personification, isn't it? You're ascribing some characteristic to April that's a human characteristic, and you're giving roots, you're making them dull. Dull means sort of they're dumb, they're not awake, and they're waking up with the spring rain that gets in there, and this dead land is suddenly coming to life. It's breeding, it's mixing, it's stirring, all those wonderful gerund verbs there. So I think eventually the land is a substitute for the human soul. The land is the soul. Your soul is coming alive. Okay, so deep, profound poem. It doesn't get any easier for the next 400 lines either. All right, so poems can surprise you. Here's a fun poem. This is by a very well-known poet named Ogden Nash. And Ogden Nash tended to write very funny little poems, and this is a good one. It's called The Adventures of Isabel by Ogden Nash. Isabel met an enormous bear. Isabel didn't care. The bear was hungry. The bear was ravenous. The bear's big mouth was cruel and cavernous. The bear said, Isabel, glad to meet you. How do, Isabel? Now I'll eat you. Isabel didn't worry. Isabel didn't scream or scurry. She washed her hands and she straightened her hair up. Then Isabel quietly ate the bear up. Remember I told you a lot of poems can surprise you, and this one definitely surprises you. There's some hyperbole there. We talked about that, right? This exaggeration. Could she literally eat that bear up? She just did, I guess. Can the bear talk? No, that's personification, I suppose. And then there's some cool words. Remember, poets love words. And I became very, my vocabulary became very expansive. It became quite large when I was young because I loved to read. And when I came to a word I didn't know, like ravenous, which means extremely hungry, or cavernous, which means like a cave, big and open like a cave, cavernous, I would look those up. I encourage you guys to do the same. So poems can surprise you. Poems can make you think. So here is a poem. It is a type of poetry style called a haiku. Haiku is a Japanese poetry, but all sorts of people do it. The nature of a haiku is that it tends to be about nature. It also usually has a very strict form, 7 syllables in the first line, 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second line, and 5 syllables again in the third line, and it kind of creates an image. So let me read this haiku by Yosa Busan. First autumn morning, the mirror I stare into shows my father's face. All right, so it's just one sentence. It just gives you one image. What is it literally about? Well, guy gets up one morning in autumn, in fall, he looks in the mirror, and he sees his father's face. Okay, but this is an iceberg poem, and you should be thinking right now, what does this poem really mean? What does it really mean? Autumn. Why is it autumn? Why does the poet not say one spring morning? He says autumn. What happens in autumn? The leaves start falling off the trees. Things start getting brown or yellow. Nature is getting ready for winter, the last season. So this person wakes up, probably in the middle of his life, and looks at the mirror and sees his father's reflection. Does he literally see his father's reflection? Some kids in some classes have told me, yeah, his father must be right over his shoulder looking at the mirror. No, he doesn't literally see his father's face. He sees his own face becoming like his father's. He's getting older. Does it blow your mind? Does it give you a shiver down the back of your neck? That's what poems do. Not all poems will do that for you. Certain poems will do it for you, and some will do it for me. That's the beauty of poetry. Your poem is out there waiting for you to be written or to be read. Poems can make you laugh. Here's a great poem by one of my favorite poets. I've been reading this poet since I was 7 years old and was given a book of his poems by my own father, about 40 years ago. The Nail Biter by Shel Silverstein. Some people manicure their nails. Some people trim them neatly. Some people keep them filed down. I bite them off completely. Before you start to scold, remember I have never, ever scratched a single soul. Again, it's kind of a surprise ending. It's an odd sort of rhyme scheme, but does he truly bite off his nails completely? I hope not. It sounds like hyperbole to me, sort of an exaggeration, but very funny little poem. Okay, so some poems can make you laugh. Now, here's a poem that I wrote. This is the first poem that I'm going to do for you that I've written. It won't be the last. Hope you like it. It's one I wrote last year, and it grew out of my daughter's desire for a pet, which we just could not have because she's allergic to them. I call this poem Pets. I told my mom I want a rat, or possibly a hairless cat. No chance, she said. Rats spread disease, and even bald cats make you sneeze. Then how about some common mice? No way, she said, they might have lice. A gerbil, hamster, guinea pig? Please pick a pet that doesn't dig. That ruled out dogs and striped polecats. No squirrels or toads or vampire bats. No chipmunks, woodchucks, porcupines. Absolutely no scales or spines, which meant no snakes or jumping spiders, no fish, no wolves, no water striders, no polar bears or baby ferrets, no goblin sharks or noisy parrots, no spotted toads or razorback hogs, no manta rays or poison dart frogs, nothing that barks or yowls or squawks, nothing that poops or pukes or pees, nothing you have to take for walks, nothing you have to try to please. Yikes, I cried. I'm tired of trying. Shh, I bought a lion. All right, so is this an iceberg poem or is it a pretty flower poem? Definitely a pretty flower poem. It's just designed to make you laugh, bring a smile to your face. Maybe you can relate to it. Maybe you've had a similar conversation with your mom or dad, and it has a surprise ending. Poems can certainly be sad. Here is a very sad poem for you. I'll put it up there, okay? Now, this is an iceberg poem. Remember I told you some poems, they get you in the back of your neck. They kind of give you a shiver down the spine. They make you think about something in a way you've never thought of before. So let's read this one. It's right there. It's called Upon a Child. It was written about 400 years ago by Robert Herrick. Here a pretty baby lies, sung asleep with lullabies. Pray be silent and not stir the easy earth that covers her. All right. So is that just a pretty flower poem? Is that just about a baby sleeping? No. If you think it is, you better read it again. What's happening here? The baby is asleep, but only metaphorically asleep. She's actually dead. She's in her grave. I just love this line. The easy earth that covers her. The easy earth that covers her. Why would you describe earth as easy? Have you ever heard earth described as easy? Think about it. That poet spent a lot of time thinking about why he wanted to use the word easy there. Well, what do babies usually sleep under? What do children sleep under? Blankets. So this makes the earth light and soft and easy like a blanket. So it's resting on her gently because she's a baby. She's not some old man. All right. Pretty sad, huh? Okay, let's do another one. No more sad ones. Let's do a poem that can haunt you. Okay, remember I said songs, poems. Is there much of a difference between a great song and a great poem? By now you should say, definitely not, Mr. Crisell, they're the same thing. Yes, that's true. So here is a poem called I Am a Rock, and it was a very famous song. Your teachers and your parents all know this song very well. It was written by a band called Simon and Garfunkel, which was Paul Simon who wrote it and his friend and fellow singer Art Garfunkel. So I'm going to read maybe the first two verses of this poem song. It just shows you how a poem can create powerful images. I Am a Rock by Paul Simon. A winter's day in a deep and dark December. I am alone, gazing from my window to the streets below on a freshly fallen, silent shroud of snow. I am a rock. I am an island. I've built walls, a fortress steep and mighty that none may penetrate. I have no need of friendship. Friendship causes pain. Its laughter and its loving I disdain. I am a rock. I am an island. All right, so there's a lot going on in this poem. This is definitely an iceberg poem. You have to ask yourself what character. Remember, every poem you read is not the character who's reading it, or the character in the poem is not necessarily the author. He might create a character, and I think this character in the poem is a very lonely person sitting alone in their apartment. I always think it's New York City because that's where Paul Simon was from. And what time of the year is it? Is it spring? Happy springtime? Happy summertime? No, it's dark December. You can see the alliteration there. Deep, dark December. Duh, duh, all that D sound. And he's sitting up there and he's gazing out his window. And what does he see? A happy little snowscape with kids playing? No, he sees a freshly fallen, silent shroud of snow. Do you see all that beautiful alliteration? What is a shroud? A shroud is something you put over a dead body when you put it into the tomb. Well, they don't use shrouds anymore, I don't think, but you'd wrap a dead body in a shroud and you put it in a coffin or in the tomb. So the snow is like a shroud over the body of the city, which is presumably dead. And what is his conclusion there? I am a rock, I am an island. That's a metaphor, right? Is he literally a rock? Is he literally an island? Of course not. What does it mean to be a rock, an island? Well, he keeps telling us a little bit more about it. He's built walls. He's built a fortress, steep and mighty. Has he literally built these things? No, again, he's extending this metaphor, and he's changing the metaphor now. His fortress is the walls he's put up around himself to keep others from going in. Maybe he loved somebody, and that person broke his heart, or had a great friend who betrayed him, so he doesn't want friendship. He doesn't want anything like that anymore. He wants to be all alone. He's a rock. What does it mean to be a rock in this case? Do rocks feel things? Do they cry? No, they feel nothing. They're hard, and it's impossible to get through to them or hurt them. Rock, he's an island. Pretty deep poem, right? And that's a rock and roll song. Let's go to poems that inspire you. Tons of poems have been written just to inspire you to be great, or to, keep the course and not despair. So this is a very famous poem called Don't Quit. And I'll just read a couple of the first two verses here. Well, maybe I'll read the first verse here and the last verse. Don't Quit by Edgar Guest. When things go wrong, as they sometimes will, when the road you're trudging seems all uphill, when the funds are low and the debts are high, and you want to smile, but you have to sigh, when care is pressing you down a bit, rest if you must, but don't you quit. Success is failure turned inside out, the silver tint of the clouds of doubt, and you never can tell how close you are. It may be near when it seems so far. So stick to the fight when you're hardest hit. It's when things seem worst that you must not quit. All right, so this is sort of a poem that gives you a lesson. I wouldn't call it a deep iceberg poem. I think it's more or less straightforward. It's telling you, don't quit. But that doesn't mean it's not great poetry. There's some wonderful language in there. You notice in that first stanza, something we haven't talked about yet, but another rhetorical or literary technique that many authors use is antithesis. That means juxtaposing or putting next to each other two opposite words or ideas, or two contrasting words or ideas. So you can see in that first stanza, you want to smile, but you have to sigh. So you want to be happy, but you're sighing because you're sad. But you can rest, he's saying, but don't you quit. Rest, don't quit. Your funds are low, your debts are high. Low, high, funds, meaning your money. You don't have much money, but you have a lot of debts. You owe a lot of money. So that's called antithesis. All right, so a couple more, and then we'll be done. All right, so here's one. It is called The Shortest and Sweetest of Songs. That's by George MacDonald. Come Home. That's it. So now we're starting to wonder and question the whole concept of poetry. Is that even a poem? A lot of kids will say, no, absolutely not. It's too short. You can't just have 2 words in a poem. But let's analyze it a bit. How many stanzas? 1 stanza. How many lines? 2 lines. Does it rhyme? Sure looks like it rhymes, doesn't it? But thanks to the English language, it doesn't quite rhyme. I might call it a near rhyme or a half rhyme. Remember we talked about that in the last class. Come home. What does it mean? Well, sometimes you get a lot of information about a poem from the title. Some people want to just ignore the title. You better not ignore the title in this case because it tells you kind of more than the poem itself does. The shortest and sweetest of songs. So, who and why is this poem being written? Well, I think the person wrote it for somebody who is far away from him, that he loves. Maybe it's a child, maybe it's his wife, who knows? But he's sending out this sweet, sweet, short song to that person, almost like an old-time telegraph or a text message. Come home. Why didn't he just put it on 1 line? It would have been a nice little sentence. Come home. He chose to put it on 2 lines. That's a poetic choice, isn't it? Why? Well, I think because he's separated from the one he loves, just like the words come and home are separated from each other. Those 2 words, they could be 1,000 miles apart. So it sort of signals visually the distance between the person who is writing the poem and the person who's away from him. Come home. Very beautiful little poem. All right, this is our last one we'll do. This is always very controversial. There it is, right there. That's the poem. There's no title. And in fact, the author, whose name is Aram Saruman, he wrote it in 1965 or so, and he didn't even put his name to it, but everybody knew it was by him, and he got paid like, geez, $4,000 for it in today's money. So, who wants to read it? Go for it at home. Read it. Hard. What word does it look like? Light, right? But he spelled it wrong. Light. A lot of people say light. There is no wrong way to say this word, and there's no right way to say this word. Is it a poem? I'll let you decide whether it's a poem. I struggle with it. I don't think it's a good poem, but it certainly makes you think about what a poem is. Maybe this is not meant to be read at all, this particular poem. Maybe it's merely meant to be looked at, and the idea penetrates your mind like light through a window. Who knows? All right, so I think that's enough for today. I hope you enjoyed those poems. Tomorrow, or rather the next time we meet, we're going to go through one very famous poem by Robert Frost, and we're going to finally begin. I'm going to give you a methodology. I'm going to give you a little sheet of how to analyze a poem in a systematic way, but it'll be fun, and I call it the SMILE method. I didn't make it up, I found it online, but SMILE method, and SMILE stands for S-M-I-L-E, structure, meaning, imagery, language, and emotion. You're going to find each one of those things in the poem that we'll read next time. So, hope you had a good time. I will see you again very soon. Till then, go find some poems, go write some poems. Adios.